So without further ado, let me pass over to Matt, and let's have a look at the US market and what their really deep, rich data tells about where travel is at. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Chris. And again, it's good to be with everybody today. So let me see here. There we go. So wanted to talk a little bit today about the Daily Travel Index. We started this project back in March, and over the past corresponding number of weeks, it's really provided, I think, some really interesting insights. And worth noting that this is a free tool available to everyone on our website. So everything that we look at today, just about, with a few caveats, is freely available to you on the website, Arrivalist.com. Now, we all agree that tourism's recovery here in the continental United States will be led by the drive markets. And so a lot of what we're talking about today focuses exclusively on that. At Arrivalist, most of you on this call are likely at least somewhat familiar with us if you're in the continental US, maybe not if you're at international locations, but Arrivalist works through multi-sourced anonymized GPS location data. So we take essentially a huge cross-section of the US population and balance that to be a representative sample of the entire population. And it's quite accurate, 30 feet or less, and of course, compliant with all of the various privacy rules that we now live by, CCPA, GDPR as an example. However, this particularly large data set, we wanted to look at it, but then also shift its focus just a little bit. And what we came up with was the Daily Travel Index. So I'm not sure how to go backwards. There we are. And the Daily Travel Index is a subset of our larger data panel. And what we've done is we've taken a filtered view of drive market activity by Americans, and we've indexed that looking at daily travel relative to an average volume that we established for travel pre-pandemic, which in this case is February of 2020. And for the panel, we're looking at just trips over 50 miles or more, where the user spends at least 2 hours in the destination, and exclusively looking at trips by automobile. So we're excluding other forms of transportation, like airplanes, for instance. And of course, we're filtering out all the usual noise, freight, deliveries, and commuters. So you go to the website and you'll get a pretty good overview. I won't spend too much time on this, but what we're going to be looking at today will focus primarily just on what this particular graph is telling us. The thing to note is that baseline, the 0%, represents the aggregated average volume of daily trip activity in the month of February. Now, we're sitting here in May, close to Memorial Day, and certainly the first thing a lot of you are probably thinking is, well, May doesn't compare at all to February, and you'd be correct. It is a bit of a tough comparison, and we're working on year-over-year data for this particular subset. We'll probably be rolling that out pretty soon. But for now, the comparisons really do kind of work, and the reason for that is that as we look at what's been happening here as of recently, a lot of that volume that we're going to see, you'll notice that even in these weeks that we've had and weekends in April and May, they're still well below what we considered normal in the month of February. So typically in February, we would see daily travel index volumes somewhere in the 60% over that baseline right here. And in May, we probably expect that to be well over in excess of 100% over that baseline. So it gives you some idea, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. What have we observed so far? I'm going to kind of go through these fairly quickly because of our time constraints today. So hopefully I don't go too fast for anybody, but really, first and foremost, the trends are pretty clear. The travel activity here in the United States by car, so drive market activity really, is slowly going up. We saw the bottoming out back around April 3rd, that particular weekend. And since then, as a country, we have risen up to about 59% above that. We've seen a 59% increase rather since April 3rd. And we're just about over the baseline now on weekend travel. But again, if you look back towards February, you can see what was normal in February. And it gives you a good idea that although the trends are positive, we still have an awful long way to go. Now, as we look at this by mileage band, when you go to the website, you'll notice you'll be able to look at 3 particular mileage bands. So you'll be able to look at 50 to 100 miles, 1 to 250, and then 250 plus. And this is really crucial because those mileage bands can help you define and provide some context to the drive market that might be applicable for your destination. So if you're a destination in the Northeastern US, you don't have to worry quite as much about the 250 plus mile trips as you do if you're in Texas, or maybe one of the other Western states, Utah, for instance, because people have to drive such a much further distance. But you'll see the trends across the 3 mileage bands for the country here, as well as what we've seen in terms of observed volume so far. The vast majority of the trips are still occurring, in that 50 to 100 mile range. And you can see a little bit of variation in terms of the 3 different bands here. Although generally speaking, the trends are pretty uniform across all 3 mileage bands. It's just in how they relate to that indexed baseline. So you can see that we're inching a little bit closer for longer trips, whereas with 50 to 100 mile trips, we're still under the baseline and still a little bit further distance to go to get back to normal. Now, I want to show you the trends that we're seeing across all of each of the 5 regions of the US, because there are some pretty marked differences. First, we're going to look at the Southwest, including here in Texas, as well as Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. And you'll see that since hitting that bottom, we increased about 61% between the 3rd of April and May 8th, which was the weekend before this last. You'll also see that in the Southwest, there's been a little bit of a plateau effect these past 3 weekends. And this is data right up to this last weekend, a couple days ago. We definitely have hit a plateau effect, and you're going to see this plateau across each of the regions. As Chris and I were talking about in a run up to today's webinar, I really feel like it's a rubber band effect pre-Memorial Day. I feel like the rubber band is getting stretched back. And if I were a betting man, I would say it's going to get let loose in a big way for Memorial Day. Now, where that volume ultimately ends up is anybody's guess, but it does seem like that's what's going on. As you can see here for the Southwest, one of the more active regions in the country, there were pretty steady trends, a sharp increase from the last weekend of April till the first weekend of May, and then that plateau effect. Additionally, we've also been monitoring day of week travel. And so for the Southwest, you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. Not quite used to using this interface, everybody, so I apologize for the misclicks. And you can get a general idea that, and this will hold true for all of the regions, that Friday is really where the majority of that travel, or the most of that travel, is happening. We've not seen, even in the Southwest, midweek travel really rebounding in a big way yet. You can see it has still quite a ways to go, even compared to what was normal in February. In the Western US, you'll see quite a bit of activity as well, about 48% increase since the 3rd, that same plateau effect, a little bit more muted, and probably not surprising that it's a little more muted than the Southwest, given that a lot of these states are still under pretty stringent lockdown orders, especially California. And the same story with looking at day of week travel. So you can see once again that midweek remains relatively flat, even compared to the bottom. In the Southeastern US, you'll see a more similar curve to the Southwest, same plateau, but you can start to see the differences in regions of the country where more states are not under as stringent lockdowns. However, what's going to be interesting, and we'll explore this in a minute, is that there's still not uniformity in terms of trip activity according to a state's lockdown orders, or even virus cases, and we'll look at that in a minute. And again, same story with midweek travel for the Southeastern US. So far, we're just not seeing a lot of that midweek travel by auto happening yet, which probably doesn't surprise anyone before Memorial Day. In the Midwestern US, you'll see that they're probably the closest in activity increase to the Southwest. So about a 60% or just under 60% increase since the 3rd. And really one of the only regions that this past weekend sort of broke out of that plateau slump that we've seen, that was pretty common for a lot of other parts of the country. But again, midweek travel still fairly plateaued, very, very low. Now, the Northeastern US is an interesting story here. First thing you'll notice is that it shows a 68% increase since the 10th if we count this past weekend, which was a bit of an oddball amongst all of the regions. It was really the only one that showed this kind of growth. But what is interesting to note is that, and we'll look at this specifically for New York here in just a bit, this might have been a little bit weather dependent. I believe that right in the middle right here, where you see this dip between these two peaks right here, was a bad weather day or a bad weather weekend. I think it was like 48, maybe a wintry mix overnight in some parts of New York that particular weekend. So we'll look at that in a bit, but this was really interesting because up until this past weekend, the Northeast was really one of the few places that was under a 40% increase since bottoming out, and now it's really had this big spike. Whether or not that's sustained, we'll see. And certainly Memorial Day is going to be very, very telling. So if you're in one of these regions, I really suggest checking in with the Daily Travel Index on next Tuesday to see if this huge increase is a sustained thing, or hopefully it gets eclipsed. And then there's also the same pattern that we've been seeing with midweek trips. Although there is a little bit of a growth curve you can see here compared to some of the other regions for trips on Thursday. So looking at the Northeastern US, I just also wanted to make a quick point. A lot of that growth that we're seeing is specifically in the 50 to 100 mile band. It's a little bit more pronounced, I think, for the Northeast than in most parts of the country, where it's maybe just a little bit more spread out. So again, and this really underscores an important point that I'll say again shortly, is that as you look at the Daily Travel Index as a tool, really be cognizant of what your drive market is. If you're in New Jersey, you have a lot of population you can pull on that is not that far away. So this mileage band, this graph is really what you're looking at for a lot of the states that you're going to be interested in, more so than down here. On the other hand, if you're in Texas, a lot of our destinations, you've got to travel 200, 250 miles to get to from any of the major population centers. So this becomes much more important, as does 100 and 250 mile. I think for the industry as a whole, the 100 to plus mile bands are also super important because I think they signify growth in the overnight market by auto as well, because that 50 to 100 mile is much more likely to be made up of day trippers than the other two mileage bands. So a few closing observations. The impact of stay-at-home orders has been a little bit unclear. Now, in terms of the overall impact to volume, it is clear. So this is California and Texas, and you can very clearly see that Texas has had higher index values since the bottom when they were actually very close right here. You can see that the volume in Texas has been much higher. There's no doubt about that. But the trends are relatively the same. It's just the volumes are off a little bit, but the trends are fairly similar to one another. Looking at New York, I mentioned this earlier about New York, and you can see here that these three spikes all corresponded to weekends where the weather was pretty good. And I'm looking specifically at New York City, so there's probably some variation throughout the state, of course. But just looking at New York City, look at the one big dip, and I wouldn't say this is perfectly scientific, Chris, but I thought it was very interesting that the power of weather, obviously New York being very, very hard hit, and yet weather seems to have played a bigger role over the last few weeks in keeping people home. And then I'm going to try to go through this as quick as I can, but an interesting point has been, the New York Times has created a really cool resource where they bucket all of the states according to whether or not their cases are going up or down. And if you look at these three buckets, what you'll immediately notice is that the results are kind of all over the place. In the bottom of this particular group is Maine, so way down here, and at the top of it is Texas. Texas has cases that are on the increase right now, unfortunately. And then you can see everybody else just kind of all over the place. Again, the general trends are the same, but there's a matter of certainly a big difference in volume or index values between these states. If we go to the next bucket, this is the largest. These are the folks that are fortunate to have a flat curve currently. Again, you see a lot of the same thing where there's quite a bit of bunching. There's certainly some big differences, between the top and the bottom in this particular group, but more likely it seems, at least my hypothesis is that it's driven by a lot of other factors not really related to the virus or the number of cases in a particular state. And in this particular bucket, again, you see the states that have a decreasing curve, which New York is one of those, but also places like Georgia and Iowa. And once again, you can see that there's not a huge difference in terms of the overall trends. Volumes, yes, but overall trends, no. You can see that the curves for trip activity kind of just rock along here, and even if you look at these last 3 weekends, there's a little bit of difference in which state ended up at the top. And what's interesting about this particular graph is that these states are geographically very disparate. They're all over the place across a lot of different political lines, geographic lines. So it's really, really interesting to look at. Takeaways here. First, from just a personal hypothesis, I think the stay-at-home orders and the COVID-19 trending have certainly expected the speed of recovery. You see in some of those states where the volumes are a little lower or higher, in some states and others that are even in the same buckets. But I think, looking especially at, popular destination states, a big part of this will be, when can we open Disney World and Universal in Florida? Because that obviously will greatly impact the level of activity in that particular state. But really, it's a mix of economic and psychological factors, things like consumer confidence, the perception of the safety of travel, political disposition, regional psyche. These are all really potent influences as well on whether or not people will return to travel quickly or not. It's a simple hypothesis, but it underscores a super complex problem. And to get to the heart of that problem, I think we really are going to have to continue to focus on both quantitative and qualitative factors. My takeaways, my 1, 2, 3 here. First, it's really going to be critical for you guys to, when you're looking at the daily travel index, to layer some context when you're assessing your drive markets, your trends across both the economic and psychological factors, but really establishing things like, what are my drive markets specific to me? Do I need to be focused on the 50 to 100 at all, or do I need to really be more focused on the longer mileage bands? And I would really be monitoring for trends in those specific bands, as well as paying attention to the economic and psychological factors that might be influencing travel intent in those states as well. And then geolocation data. I always say this, and I'll say it one more time. It's just one leg of a necessary triangle of information. We have to have sentiment, which is best accomplished via survey work. We also need booking and search trends. We need some of that forward-looking information. So while I think Arrivalist provides a really strong leg of the research triangle, we're just one factor. And fortunately, a lot of this information is freely available by partners like Miles and Longwoods, as well as Adara and many others. The current trends are unmistakable. The challenge, I think, for all of you is really in how to handle even reduced volumes of travelers in our destinations safely. But I think undoubtedly that time is now to, hopefully you've already been into the middle of this planning, but the visitors are coming. And so I think the challenge for our industry now is to really be prepared to welcome these folks safely, both for their safety as well as that of our locals. So thank you for having me, everyone. If you have any questions, my email's there on the screen, and I'll be happy to answer any of those questions that you might have. Thanks, Chris.